What is up, everybody, and welcome. In today's video, we are taking one of the most special looks at one of the most special knives. This is the Shirogorov and Brad Southard knives collaboration from a couple years ago. It is the RFT, or Russian Flipping Tonto. This knife is super sick, and I am incredibly excited to jump in and get started on this one with you guys. Now, you may hear the low hum of a couple of fans. I do apologize. It is like 1,000,000,000 degrees out right now, and my house is not the most weatherproofed, and so frankly, I need these fans on or you're not going to get this video because I will melt into a puddle. So I apologize for the perhaps fuzzy audio, but just bear with me on this one, guys. So the first thing that I want to sort of take a look at here is the aesthetics. This knife is super huge. You can see I don't have to get it very close to the phone to take up the entire screen there. Now, interestingly, this titanium, incredibly smooth and well finished. Definitely a fingerprint horse. So let's go ahead and get this wiped down real quick. There's no way to keep fingerprints off the knife as I show it to you throughout the video, so we'll just sort of take a quick look here with it smoothed down. See, they've done a really great job of finish work here. And of course, that really sweet milling. See that sort of play with the light, how sort of deep that cavern is. Very cool. Love the chamfering that they've done all across this section through the front, really the whole frame. But you can see it's heavily chamfered here in the front. Beautiful blue titanium pivot collars around raised custom screws with a polished edge. Kind of a slender, tucked away flipper tab, but good jimping. Nice chamfering. You can see some significant chamfering in the back here, starting at this point, sort of working its way down the frame of the knife. Beautiful blue titanium backspacer with some cool milled pockets. Kind of interesting cutout around this beautiful pin for a potential lanyard, and the beautiful fluting done through there as well, raised here on the end just a bit for aesthetics. You can see the front of the knife is hidden hardware, of course minus the pivot. Absolutely gorgeous. You do have this screw here going all the way through the frame. Very gorgeous. Lock side, you can see we have a cool little cutout here with that same milling that travels up the center as well. Beautiful shaped clip too. Just check out that clip. I really like the way it sort of sweeps this way, whereas this section of milling sweeps upward like this. Very cool. Of course, perfectly centered blade. It seems to be leaning a little bit to the right, but it wasn't when I got it. It might have just loosened up. My buddies and I have been flipping this thing like nobody's business. And guys, you all know, especially if you've been watching, that frame locks really just haven't been sort of tickling my fancy of late. A huge knife like this, frame lock, kind of smooth, titanium, not a whole lot of color. This knife really doesn't fit sort of a lot of the generalities that I find myself leaning towards when collecting knives. Of course, sorry, I've gotten all the way into this video without realizing that I have not established that this is not mine. I do apologize. This knife is, of course, on loan from the man, the myth, the legend, at Heels with Steel on Instagram. His name is Mike. He is amazing. He has sent a bunch of knives along. And this is on loan from him. But yeah, so even though this knife doesn't really fit a lot of those normal categories, I gotta say, one, I'm a big sucker for Tontos, so obviously this blade is sick, in my opinion. Got a beautiful hollow grind. Compound grind. But, guys, I gotta say, there's a lot of, sort of, I think, interest around the price of this knife. They made 200. This one is number 160. We'll actually take a look at that. 160 of 200, and we do have the single row barrel bearings from Shirogorov. Pretty cool. When these came out, obviously they were delivered by lottery via Recon 1, and people, you know, were pretty stoked about them. I got to try one actually at the 2017 Blade Show, so I already kind of knew that I was interested in the knife and that I really liked it. But of course, you only get to hold things very briefly at the shows, so you know, I flipped it a couple times and I put it back down and I moved on. But we saw the prices rocket up to around $3,000 for this sucker, and it sat there for probably a good year, but we're finally seeing those prices come down. And more recently, we've seen them skimming the $2,400, $2,200, and $2,000 mark. I don't often recommend knives sort of so holistically. You know, knives are very sort of based around personal preference. There's a lot to consider. But if you are out there and you are collecting things like CNC made knives, and you know, you're sort of like looking for that next thing in your collection, I don't think $3,000 is the right price for this knife. $3,000 buys a whole lot of knife, and at the end of the day, this thing is just some titanium. $2,400. This is pretty much a steal. I am absolutely in love with this knife. So if we take a look at this action, which I'll never really be able to demonstrate well enough on video, not only is it sort of super Grimsmo-y insofar as it will close, the blade will close upward sort of into the closed position. Sorry, again, it's very, very hot, so my hands are like 10 times sweatier than they should be. Normally you don't slip off the flipper tab quite that much. But I don't know, it's just, so it's got that same amount of sort of, like, you can see it's a very long blade, and so similarly to the Norseman, you can kind of, or even a servo, you can kind of expect it to sort of, like, swing up against gravity. And that's all well and good, but there's something about the way this knife does it, and the smoothness with which it does it, and the quietness with which it does it, that really, there is no comparison. It's sort of like the sound that it makes when it bounces off of the stop pin is the best, most muted, most sort of like respectable sound that I've ever heard when a knife hits the stop pin. So I don't think it's really going to pick up on the mic, but I just feel like, so for example, I have this servo sitting here, also on loan from Mike, and it does the same thing that a Norseman would, right? Like, so you can kind of hold it like that, and it closes, and it's got this really nice mechanical snap to it when it closes. It's a really nice sound. It's pleasant. It sort of sounds like a knife, you know, like you would expect it to sound, but it's still pretty metallic. It's still, it's pretty audible, and it's a bit higher pitched, and you know, the Norseman makes a similar sound. This knife doesn't do any of that. It's sort of just, I don't know, it just feels very muffled. It almost feels like if the stop pin had maybe like just a little bit of linen wrapped around it, so that when it hit, you know, it's still metal on metal contact in the sense that you can hear that it's metal, but it's very muffled and sort of deafened by that imaginary linen. And so I just, this is not the best, this is clearly not the best video I've ever made. I'm sort of like rambling, and it's because like this one is like stressed me out, guys, because I just, it's got so much that's so hard to describe and that you really can't appreciate unless it's actually in your hand. Just sort of the level of detail and execution on the milling, especially, this is not a 2018 knife, is absolutely fantastic. The inside is beautiful. The overall design is beautiful. I love this like double curve with the fingers. It sort of like works correctly with your fingers and is very ergonomic, but also just sort of like beautiful, and really gives the knife sort of a unique flavor. I'm personally really partial to the fact that it's a Tonto. I know not a lot of people are into that, but I really like that. I sort of also like that, the Tonto cuts this way in the front and the same way in the back. I sort of love that like parallelogram sort of style of design in a knife. The deployment on it is pretty typical for like a Shirogorov, right? So pretty light lock bar. You definitely need to make good contact with the flipper tab, but if you do, you can see the blade absolutely fires out. It's incredible. Now, the blade is very long, so similarly to on a Norseman, if your finger sort of half slips off of the flipper tab when you go to flip it, it won't always make it all the way out, but that's sort of to be expected with such a long blade, and if you don't make proper contact. But I don't really slip off of this flipper tab. I have a pretty easy time opening this knife, and it has been the knife that, guys, I've been reaching for this thing every day. I've been carrying this knife to work more than any other knife, whether it's in my collection or in the large group of knives that Mike sent along for review. This knife is the one that goes in the pocket the most when I need to cut something that I'm not worried will scratch the blade. So like I haven't used it to break down boxes or anything, because if I put a big scratch in this satin, I'm going to feel pretty bad since it's not my knife. But I've used it to open several packages. I have used it to cut several pieces of like paper and bits and stuff, just like, and like strings, and just I reach for this knife every single time in kind of the same way that I've always reached for whatever Shirogorov is in my collection at the time as a user. But the Tonto Edge in particular has made this really, really great for the cutting task that I've needed it for, and just every time that you're done with it and you get to close it, it just is such a pleasure, and just every time you guys see my hands go off screen, I'm like stretching my eyes back, because it's like that's how like stressed out about this I am, is that like, anyway, that I guess I'm done rambling. But you should buy this. If you have an opportunity to buy this knife for pretty much anything less than $2,500, and you know that a CNC frame lock is something that you're going to be relatively interested in from the get-go, like maybe you have a servo, maybe you have a Norseman, maybe you have a Shirogorov 95R or a Hattie R, and you're looking for that sort of next step. Maybe you've been considering custom division knives. I've handled a lot of custom division knives. I've now handled a couple of these. I've handled some Sigmas. I really feel like these collaboration pieces are the best pieces that come out of Shirogorov. Again, only in my experience. Now, I haven't gotten to handle like a bunch of custom division knives, right? And the ones I have handled aren't necessarily broken in. They're usually at shows. So take all of that sort of with a grain of salt, but just understand that as somebody that doesn't like plain titanium knives, somebody who no longer really collects knives that are this big, somebody who doesn't like knives that are this thin, and somebody who doesn't like frame locks, I would spend $2,500 on this knife. So I think that's really saying something. And I think this one's sort of fallen off a lot of people's radars, which is why we're seeing those prices actually come down to something a little bit more reasonable. And I have to say, if you see one pop up for sale and it's less than $2,500 and you have the money and you know that it's something that you're not going to hate, then it's 100% worth pulling the trigger. One, because I think they're pretty valid in the market. I think that even with the price coming down, I don't see them going much lower than $1,800. Because it's just such a good knife, and there are still so few of them out in the world. And two, you should try it. Like, just buy this knife. Again, I don't usually come out of the gate just sort of stumbling over my words, and sort of I get what would you say, like I have like a crush on this knife, I guess, right? But you really have to sort of see it to believe it. You really have to hear it to sort of behold sort of just how sophisticated the acoustics are. Really, really sophisticated acoustics. The way the blade is perfectly flush with the frame as you tilt it sideways. I mean, it is just such a precise piece of kit. It feels so freaking good in the hand. It is absolutely unbelievably good at all cutting tasks. You know, the blade stock isn't crazy thick, but it's not crazy thin either, but this is still going to absolutely destroy a tomato in a good way, in a very clean and slicey way. And it is just going to serve you incredibly well. I love taking the clip in and out of my pocket. I love carrying this knife. I love the way. I love everything about it, guys. I really, I wouldn't make any changes. I think the over retail price is totally reasonable, except maybe when you get 2,800, $3,000 is definitely pushing it. I think if you sort of already loved the aesthetics of this knife and then you saw this video and you were like, okay, now that I know that it's mechanically that great too, maybe it's worth like 2,800 bucks if it's really a knife that you're gonna truly keep and cherish. But I think at about 2,500 bucks, this knife's worth being in anybody's collection. So thank you all so much for watching. Of course, if you'd like to see super sweet pictures of this knife, you can check me out on Instagram at tovarishworks. You can check out the owner at Heels with Steel on Instagram as well. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next time.